That's the critical question. I think the war is coming to an end. It's not necessarily going to end because of anything that's happened in Alaska or anything going on in Washington right now. The front in Ukraine has effectively collapsed. There simply are no more human beings to man fortifications and defenses, no one to carry weapons and go into battle to defend this regime in Kiev. So I think at this stage, it's kind of a mop-up exercise because the Russians want to be sure that nothing is left behind them. In other words, as they move forward, they want to be certain there's no resistance behind them at all, as well as in front of them. So I think that much is clear. So this will come to some sort of an end. But I think what we've been witnessing in Alaska is a little different from what a lot of people expected. I think the Russians made it very clear that their positions are effectively unchanged. And you'll remember there's this alleged willingness to quote unquote swap territory. Well, that never was true at all. But what the Russians did say is that they would be willing to consider adjustments to where troops were in Kherson and Zaporizhia. These are in the southwest of eastern Ukraine. But that was about it. Otherwise, I think President Trump walked out understanding that Ukraine is going to have to be neutral. It can never join NATO. And the Russians are not going to accept anything less than that. And they want this regime to be gone. You know, they're not going to allow a regime to stay in power that is incurably hostile to Moscow. They don't want to have to refight this war in another 5, 10, 15, 20 years. Now, when it comes to Washington, for the first time, I felt a little sympathy for the Western globalists that are running the show in Europe, because it looked to me as though President Trump had convened his own private reality TV show. Because all of this was broadcast. These people trooped in a little row, all sat there representing what people were openly calling vassal states and listening to whatever Trump said. And Trump listened to them and was reasonably polite, but largely dismissed most of what they said and tried, I think, to reiterate what he had learned at the conference with President Putin. And I think Zelensky has already absolutely disavowed any willingness to cooperate at all in any territorial arrangement that does not restore everything to him, which of course is absurd. And as long as he stays committed to that, I don't think there's going to be any sort of formal end to anything. But I think he certainly stands an excellent chance of being awakened by Russians in Kiev. And I think that could absolutely happen unless there is suddenly dramatic change. He disappears. Someone else steps forward to represent what's left and is willing to negotiate directly with the Russians and is somebody they think they can trust. And that is a big issue here. Trust.
Right.
Why should the Russians trust in anything? And, you know, President Trump made a comment within the last couple of days that I thought was outrageously stupid, to be blunt. He talked about Americans being part of some sort of force potentially on the ground in Ukraine as a result of any security arrangement. Well, that's an impossibility. They just fought a war to make sure nothing like that happens. So I'm not sure he's clear in his mind, but I do know that Mr. Putin is absolutely clear about what he wants.
And can you just explain to the audience the difference and why NATO would much rather have a ceasefire and why Putin wants to have a peace agreement?
Well, a ceasefire implies no arrangement. Simply what you hear, a ceasefire. Everybody stops shooting at each other. And that means that there are no restrictions on what either side can do. That means that in addition to evacuating wounded, you can also bring in new forces, new equipment, new capabilities. Ceasefire is just that. We all agree that at such and such a time, we will stop fighting each other. How long will that last? You know, as long as both sides are willing to do it. There is nothing permanent about it. There is nothing that contributes necessarily to a peace agreement, which is ultimately what at least President Trump says he wants, and is what President Putin wants. You can continue to fight and still negotiate a peace treaty. Now, people think that's unusual. No, it isn't at all. That's happened many, many times in many, many wars where people said, fine, let's talk while we're fighting.
Right.
And obviously, whenever the fighting stops, wherever we are, based on the peace arrangements that we've made, we'll abide by those. But right now, until there is an agreement, that stipulates certain conditions. Where will the border run? Who is in charge? And so forth. We'll continue to fight. There's nothing wrong with that. That makes great sense. And that is the standard operation, if you will, in European history. Not, oh, let's have a ceasefire. Remember that the Germans negotiated with the Allies long before they had a ceasefire on 11 November. The ceasefire that occurs at 11 o'clock on 11 November in 1918 is a result of a peace agreement.
You know, it's interesting, Colonel. I do see a bit of change, in this meeting with Trump and Zelensky. For example, his last visit to the White House, there was obviously a very public display of Trump, certainly telling Zelensky, look, you don't have the cards. You're not in a position here. Many people felt that, Trump had thrown Zelensky under the bus, and now things had seemed to be very different. We've now seen Zelensky. He upgraded his T-shirt into a suit. I think that everybody was having a laugh about that. It definitely seemed to be a much more positive meeting, for Zelensky and the Europeans. But how do you feel, how do you think Zelensky and the Ukrainian people are taking these latest developments from the White House? Are they looking at that as a positive? Are they feeling, hopeful for the future? How do you interpret this?
Well, my information suggests that the Ukrainians want an end to the war overwhelmingly. I also am getting a lot of information that suggests that they would like to be rid of Mr. Zelensky. He is by no means popular at all. I mean, he sent 1.8 million Ukrainian soldiers to their deaths in a war that shouldn't have been fought and could never be won. So how popular can the man be?
True.
He's got the secret police all over the country trying to sort of press people into military service.
Right.
And you've got housewives, mothers, daughters, sons, everybody's coming out to protect dad or their brother or something else and get rid of the secret police. So I think the issue for Ukraine right now is we want an end to this. And if we have to give up something, then we're prepared to do it because we must have an end to this terrible war. The other thing is that I'm sure the Ukrainians have been brainwashed into believing that everything on that map was granted to them in perpetuity. We all know the circumstances under which that crazy map was drawn when it was drawn. It's not consistent with history, with culture, with ethnicity, with language, or anything. And I think there are older Ukrainians that know that. But the bottom line is that I think the Ukrainians just want an end to it. Now, the Europeans, if I were a German watching this, I would be disgusted beyond belief. What are we doing? Mertz looks like a child in kindergarten asking for permission to speak.
Right.
He speaks, he says something that Trump doesn't agree with, and he's essentially told, thank you for your interest in the conversation, go back to sleep. If you look at Georgia Maloney, I always get a charge out of her because she's always rolling her eyes and leaning to one side, like, what am I doing here? What's the purpose of this whole thing? Well, Georgia is the one with some common sense. She wants to get out of the European Union. Well, the European Union has turned out to be a tyranny. Everybody hates the damn thing because it's not satisfied with organizing trade across borders. They want to dictate what everybody's going to do in all of their schools, how they're going to live, what their so-called values are supposed to be. So the EU is a catastrophe. That's going to go away before NATO does, and then NATO will follow suit. The whole thing, in my judgment, marks the end of U.S. hegemony in Europe, the end of European subordination, if you will, to U.S. national leadership. Now, I'm sure that's not what President Trump wanted, or it's what he thinks, but that's really what it is.